My dear listeners, thank you kindly for your subscriptions, your likes, and, most importantly, your comments. Without them, I would be talking only to myself, which, while occasionally amusing, is far less gratifying. Today we turn to the opening chapter of the second book of William Coxe's travels into Poland, Russia, Sweden, and Denmark. Written in the 18th century, it is at once a mirror of its age and a challenge to ours. So let us begin. And remember, history may be old, but it is never out of date.
July 24th, 1778. We entered Poland just beyond Bilitz, having crossed the rivulet Biala, which falls into the Vistula, and pursued our journey to Cracow through the territories which the House of Austria secured to itself in the late partition. The district, claimed by the Empress of Germany in her manifesto, is thus described: all that tract of land lying on the right side of the Vistula, from Silesia above Sandomir to the mouth of the San, and from thence by Franipol, Zamoise, and Rubislo to the bog. From the bog, the limits are carried along the frontiers of Red Russia to Zabras upon the borders of Volhynia and Podolia, and from Zabras in a straight line to the Dnieper, where it receives the rivulet Podhorts, taking in a small slip of Podolia, and lastly, along the boundaries separating Podolia from Moldavia. A remarkable circumstance attended the taking possession of this district, which will show with what uncertainty the limits were at first traced. The partition being made according to the map of Zanoni, the river Podhorts was taken as the eastern boundary of this dismembered province. But when the Austrian commissioners visited the spot where, according to Zanoni, the Podhorts flowed into the Dnieper, they found no river known to the inhabitants which answered to that name. They advanced, therefore, the frontiers still more eastwards, and adopting the Sibros or the Spritz for the boundary, called it the Podhorts. This ceded country has, since the partition, changed its name, and is now incorporated into the Austrian dominions under the appellation of the kingdoms of Galicia and Lodomeria, which kingdoms some ancient diplomies represent as situated in Poland, and subject to the kings of Hungary. But the most convincing proof that there ever existed such kingdoms, that they depended upon Hungary, and ought, by virtue of an hereditary though dormant title, to revert to the Empress as sovereign of Hungary, was derived from the Austrian army. For what people can resist an argument backed by 200,000 troops, unless they can defend their side of the question by an equal number? The importance of this acquisition to the House of Austria will best appear from the number of inhabitants, which, according to the numeration made in 1776, amounted to 2,580,796. The mountainous parts of Galicia and Lodomeria produce fine pasture. The plains are mostly sandy but abound in forests and are fertile in corn. The principal articles of traffic are cattle, hides, wax, and honey. These countries contain mines of copper, lead, iron, and salt, of which the latter are the most valuable. We crossed only a narrow slip of Austrian Poland, of about 86 miles in length from Bilitz to Cracow, leaving on our right hand a chain of Mount Krapak, or the ancient Carpathian Mountains. The country we passed through was at first somewhat hilly, but afterwards chiefly plain, covered with forests. The roads were bad, the villages few and wretched beyond description. The hovels, all built of wood, seemed full of filth and misery, and everything wore the appearance of extreme poverty. July 25th. About noon we arrived at the Vistula, the limits of the Austrian dominions which reach to its southern banks. According to the partition treaty, this river was marked as forming the limits between the Austrian and Polish territories. The House of Austria at first construed the Vistula to mean the old channel of that river now dry, called the Old Vistula, and by force of this strained interpretation included Casimir in the dismembered province. But not long afterwards the Empress of Germany restored Casimir to the Poles and accepted the Vistula as it now flows for the boundary of her dominions. Having entered Casimir by crossing the Vistula over a bridge, at one end of which was an Austrian soldier, and at the other a Polish sentinel, we passed the above-mentioned dry channel, termed the Old Vistula, by a second bridge, and arrived at Cracow. Cracow is a curious old town. It was formerly the capital of Poland, where the kings were elected and crowned, and was once almost the center of the Polish dominions, but is now a frontier town, a proof how much the territories of this republic have been contracted. Cracow stands in an extensive plain, watered by the Vistula, which is broad but shallow. The city and its suburbs occupy a vast tract of ground, but are so thinly peopled that they scarcely contain 16,000 inhabitants. The great square in the middle of the town is very spacious and has several well-built houses, once richly furnished and well inhabited, but most of them now either untenanted or in a state of melancholy decay. Many of the streets are broad and handsome, but almost every building bears the most striking marks of ruined grandeur. The churches alone seem to have preserved their original splendour. The devastation of this unfortunate town was begun by the Swedes at the commencement of the present century, when it was besieged and taken by Charles XII, but the mischiefs it suffered from that ravager of the north were far less destructive than those it experienced during the late dreadful commotions, when it underwent repeated sieges, and was alternately in possession of the Russians and Confederates. The effects of cannon, grape, and musket shot are still discernible on the walls and houses. In a word, Cracow exhibits the remains of a magnificent capital in ruins. From the number of fallen and falling houses, one would imagine it had lately been sacked, and that the enemy had left it only yesterday. The town is surrounded with high walls of brick, strengthened by round and square towers of whimsical shapes in the ancient style of fortification. These walls were built by Wenceslaus, King of Bohemia, during the short period in which he reigned over Poland. In Cracow we found a Russian garrison of 600 men who were stationed at the guardhouse in the center of the town. At all the gates a Russian sentinel stood on one side and a Polish sentinel on the other. The citadel was entirely occupied by Russian troops. The university was founded and endowed by Casimir the Great, and improved and completed by Ladislaus Jagiellon. The number of students amounted to about 600. The library was not remarkable either for the number or rarity of its books. Among the principal objects of attention, the librarian pointed out a Turkish book, of no intrinsic value, but esteemed a curiosity because found among the spoils at the Battle of Chotzim and presented by John Sobieski to the university as the memorial of a victory which saved his country from desolation and raised him to the throne of Poland. This university was formerly, and not unjustly, called the mother of Polish literature, as it principally supplied the other seminaries with professors and men of learning, but its lustre has been greatly obscured by the removal of the royal residence to Warsaw, and still more by the late intestine convulsions. In this city, the art of printing was first introduced into Poland by Haller, and one of the earliest books that issued from his press was the constitutions and statutes compiled by Casimir the Great, and afterwards augmented by his successors. The characters are Gothic, the same which were universally used at the invention of printing. The great initial letters are wanting, which shows that they were probably painted and afterwards worn away. The year in which this compilation was printed is not positively known, but its publication was certainly anterior to 1496, as it does not contain the statutes passed by John Albert in that year. The most flourishing period of the university was under Sigismund Augustus in the 16th century, when several of the German reformers fled from the persecutions of the Emperor Charles V and found an asylum in this city. They gave to the world several versions of the sacred writings and other theological publications, which diffused the Reformed religion over great part of Poland. The protection which Sigismund Augustus afforded to men of learning of all denominations, and the universal toleration which he extended to every sect of Christians, created a suspicion that he was secretly inclined to the new church, and it was even reported that he intended to renounce the Catholic faith and publicly profess the Reformed religion. Towards the southern part of the town near the Vistula rises a small eminence or rock, upon whose top is built the palace, surrounded with brick walls and old towers, which form a kind of citadel to the town. This palace owes its origin to Ladislaus Jagiellon, but little of the ancient structure now appears, as the greatest part was demolished by Charles XII in the year 1702, when he entered this town in triumph after the Battle of Clissow. It has been since repaired. The remains of the old palace consist of a few apartments, which are left in their ancient state as they existed in the last century. The walls of the first of these apartments are decorated with paintings of tilts and tournaments, those of the second with a representation of the coronation of a king of Poland, affirmed by the person who showed the palace to be that of Ladislaus I and to have been drawn in his time, but the style of the painting bespeaks it of a more modern date. The ceiling of the third apartment is divided into different compartments, ornamented with carved heads of extraordinary shapes and grotesque appearances. All the rooms in the palace are of fine dimensions and exhibit several remains of ancient magnificence, but are totally without furniture. This palace was formerly the residence of the kings of Poland, who, from the time of Ladislaus Lokatek, have been crowned at Cracow. The Polish and German historians differ concerning the time when the title of king was first claimed by the sovereigns of this country. But the most probable account is that in 1295, Przemyslaus assumed the regal title and was inaugurated at Gniezno by the archbishop of that diocese. He was succeeded by Ladislaus Lokatek, who, offending the Poles by his capricious and tyrannical conduct, was deposed before he was crowned, and Wenceslaus, king of Bohemia, who had married Richza, daughter of Przemyslaus, being elected in his stead, was in 1300 consecrated at Gniezno. Ladislaus, after flying from his country and undergoing a series of calamitous adventures, was at length brought to a sense of his misconduct. Having regained the affection of his subjects, he was restored in the lifetime of Wenceslaus to part of his dominions, and he recovered them all upon the demise of that monarch in the year 1305. He governed, however, for some years without the title of king, but at length in 1320 was crowned at Cracow, to which place he transferred the ceremony of the coronation, and afterwards enacted that for the future his successors should be inaugurated in the cathedral of this city. Since that period, the laws of Poland have expressly enjoined that Cracow should be the place of coronation, and such has been the superstitious attachment of the Poles to this usage that when John Sobieski was desirous of being crowned at Leopold, on account of its vicinity to the army, which he was to command against the Turks at the time of his election, the Polish patriots strongly opposed any innovation plus, and that monarch was under the necessity of repairing to Cracow for the performance of the ceremony. Since Ladislaus, all the succeeding sovereigns have been consecrated at Cracow, excepting the present king. Previous to his election, a decree was issued by the Diet of Convocation that the coronation should be solemnized for this turn at Warsaw without prejudice in future to the ancient rite of Cracow, a proviso calculated to satisfy the populace, but which will not probably prevent any future sovereign from being crowned at Warsaw, now become the capital of Poland and the residence of its kings. The diadem and other regalia used at the coronation are still kept in the palace of Cracow, under so many keys and with such care that it was impossible to obtain a sight of them. The apartments of the palace command an extensive view of the neighboring country, which is principally a large sandy plain. We observed particularly two very large mounds of earth, or barrows, one of which is by tradition called the burial place of Cracus, Duke of Poland, who is supposed to have built the town of Cracow in the year 700. The other is called the sepulchre of his daughter Wenda, who is reported to have drowned herself in the Vistula, that she might not be compelled to marry a person for whom she had entertained an aversion. The whole history of Cracus and Wenda is involved in impenetrable darkness, and these barrows, which are common in different parts of Europe, were probably anterior to the Christian era. The practice of raising barrows over the bodies of the deceased was almost universal in the earlier ages of the world. Homer mentions it as a common practice among the Greeks and Trojans. Virgil alludes to it as usual in Italy in the times treated of in the Aeneid. Xenophon relates that it obtained among the Persians. The Roman historians record that the same mode of interring took place among their countrymen, and it appears to have prevailed no less among the ancient Germans and many other uncivilized nations. In general, popular tradition allows some favorite characters in national history, like Cracus and Wenda, to usurp the honor of being buried under the most conspicuous of these monuments. At some distance from Cracow, we noticed the fortress of Landskron situated upon a rock, which the Confederates possessed during the late troubles, and from whence they made excursions as occasion offered against the Russian and Polish troops in the service of the king. By a detachment of troops from this fortress, the citadel of Cracow was taken by surprise, a gallant exploit, and which merits a particular relation. The person who showed us the palace was himself present when the Polish troops issued from a subterraneous passage and surprised the Russian garrison, consisting of 87 troops. About 4 in the morning, a party of 76 Confederates, all of whom were Poles, led by a lieutenant whose name was Bitranowski, entered the palace through a common sewer without being discovered, and repairing to the main guard, instantly fell upon the Russians. The latter were so confounded with the suddenness of the assault that they all yielded themselves prisoners without the least resistance, and the Poles became masters of the citadel. 2 or 3 Russians were killed at the first onset, and the remainder were confined in a dungeon. One soldier, however, found means to escape by climbing the wall of the citadel, and alarmed the Russian soldiers within the town. These, without delay, attacked the castle, but receiving a warm fire from the Confederates, they imagined the enemy to be more numerous than they really were, and desisted from the assault. This event happened on the 2nd of February, 1772. The same evening, Monsieur de Choisy, in the service of the Confederates of Landskron, being made acquainted with the success of the enterprise, advanced towards Cracow at the head of 800 Confederates, amongst whom were 30 or 40 Frenchmen, most of them officers, and having defeated a detachment of 200 Russians, was received into the citadel. But the Russian garrison in the town, which before consisted of only 400 men, being likewise reinforced, the Confederates in the citadel sustained a regular siege. They defended themselves with the most undaunted spirit for the space of 3 months, and at length capitulated upon the most honourable terms. I examined the subterraneous passage through which the 76 Confederates introduced themselves into the palace. It is a drain which conveys all the filth from the interior part of the palace to a small opening without the walls near the Vistula. They entered this small opening and crawled upon their hands and knees a considerable way, one behind another, until they came out through a hole in the walls of the palace, so that if the Russians had either been apprised of their attempt or had overheard them in their passage, not one person could have escaped. The danger was great, but it shows what spirit and perseverance will effect. Having viewed the palace, we visited the adjoining cathedral, which stands within the walls of the citadel. In this cathedral, all the sovereigns from the time of Ladislaus Lokatek have been interred, a few only excepted, viz. Louis and Ladislaus III, who were kings of Hungary as well as of Poland, and whose bodies were deposited in Hungary, Alexander, who died and was buried at Vilna, Henry of Valois, interred in France, and the late monarch Augustus III. The laws of Poland are as express and minute in regulating the burial as the election and coronation of the kings, and as many curious circumstances attend their interment, I shall take this opportunity of laying the ceremony before the reader. Since Warsaw has become the royal residence and the place for the election of the kings of Poland, the body of the deceased prince must be carried first to that city, where it remains until the nomination of the new sovereign has taken place. It is then conducted in great state to Cracow, and 2 days before the day appointed for the ceremony of the coronation, the king-elect, preceded by the great officers of state, with their rods of office pointing to the ground, joins the funeral procession as it passes through the streets, and follows the body to the church of St. Stanislaus, where the burial service is performed. The remains are then deposited in the cathedral adjoining to the palace. It is peculiar to the laws of Poland that the funeral of the deceased monarch should immediately precede the coronation of the new sovereign, and that the king-elect should be under a necessity of attending the obsequies of his predecessor. Historians have sagely remarked that this singular custom was instituted in order to impress the new king with the uncertainty of human grandeur, and to remind him of his duty by mixing the horrors of death with the pomp and dignity of his new station. Yet we cannot but observe that this precaution has not hitherto been productive of any visible effects, as it does not appear that the kings of Poland have governed with greater wisdom and justice than other potentates. But it is most probable that this custom took its rise from the habits of exterior homage, which the Poles affect to pay to their sovereign in compensation for the substantial dignity which they withhold from him. This spirit of mock reverence they extend beyond the grave, and while they scarcely allow to the reigning king the shadow of real authority, they heap upon a deceased monarch every possible trapping of imperial honor. The sepulchres of the kings of Poland are not distinguished by any peculiar magnificence. Their figures are carved in marble of no extraordinary workmanship, and some are without inscriptions. I felt a strong sentiment of veneration at approaching the ashes of Casimir the Great, whom I consider as one of the greatest princes that ever adorned a throne. It was not, however, the brilliancy and magnificence of his reign, his warlike achievements, nor even his patronage of the arts and sciences, but his legislative abilities and his wonderful beneficence to the inferior class of his subjects that inspired me with a reverence for his character. Casimir was born in 1310, and in 1333 ascended the throne of Poland, upon the demise of his father Ladislaus Lokatek. The Polish historians dwell with singular complacency upon his reign as the most glorious and happy period of their history, and record with peculiar pleasure the virtues and abilities of this great and amiable monarch. Nor are their praises the echoes of flattery, for they were mostly written subsequent to his death, when another family was seated upon the throne. In perusing the reign of Casimir, we can hardly believe that we are reading the history of the sovereign of a barbarous people in the beginning of the 14th century. It seems as if, by the ascendancy of his superior genius, he had anticipated the knowledge and improvements of the succeeding and more enlightened periods. From the moment of his accession, his first care was to secure his kingdom against foreign enemies. With this view, he attacked the knights of the Teutonic Order, with whom Poland had long been in an almost continual state of warfare, and obliged them to purchase a peace by the cession of Culm and Kujavia, which they had wrested from his father. He then reduced Red Russia, and annexed the Duchy of Masovia to the dominions of Poland. By these acquisitions, he not only extended the frontiers of his empire, but rendered his dominions less liable to sudden invasions. But these great successes were not able to excite in his breast the fatal spirit of military enterprise. He always considered war as a matter of necessity, not of choice, and as the means of safety rather than of glory. Having secured his frontiers, as well by his victories as by treaties with the neighboring powers, he turned his whole attention to the interior administration of his kingdom. He built several towns, enlarged and beautified others, so that Dlugosius, who wrote in the following century, says of him, "Poland is indebted to Casimir for the greatest part of her churches, palaces, fortresses, and towns," adding in allusion to a similar character given of Augustus Caesar, that he found Poland of wood and left her of marble. He patronized letters, founded the Academy of Cracow, promoted industry, and encouraged trade. Elegant in his manners and magnificent in his court, he was economical without meanness and liberal without prodigality. He was the great legislator of Poland. Finding his country without any written laws, he reviewed all the usages and customs, and digested them, with some additions, into a regular code, which he ordered to be published. He simplified and improved the courts of justice. He was easy of access to the meanest as well as the highest of his subjects, and solicitous to relieve the peasants from the oppressions of the nobility. Such indeed was the tenderness he showed to that injured class of men, and so many were the privileges which he conferred upon them, that the nobles used to call him out of derision Rex Rusticorum, the king of the peasants, perhaps the most noble appellation that ever was bestowed upon a sovereign, and far to be preferred to the titles of magnificent and great, which have been so often lavished rather upon the persecutors than the benefactors of mankind. Human nature is never perfect. Casimir was not without his failings. Voluptuous and sensual, he pushed the pleasures of the table to intemperance, and his inordinate passion for women led him into some actions inconsistent with the general tenor of honor and integrity which distinguishes his character. But these defects influenced chiefly his private, not his public deportment, or to use the expression of a Polish historian, his private failings were redeemed by his public virtues, and it is allowed by all that no sovereign more consulted the happiness of his subjects, or was more beloved at home and respected abroad. After a long reign of 40 years, he was thrown from his horse as he was hunting, and died after a short illness in the 60th year of his age, carrying with him to the grave the regret of his subjects and a claim to the veneration of posterity. He is described, for the figure of so amiable a character cannot fail to be interesting, as tall in his person and inclined to corpulency, with a majestic aspect, thick and curling hair, long beard, and a strong voice somewhat lisping. Next to the remains of Casimir repose the ashes of Ladislaus II Plus, known by the appellation of Jagiellon, the father of a race of kings called from him the Jagiellon line. This sovereign was originally Duke of Lithuania, and together with his subjects a worshipper of idols, but having embraced Christianity and espoused Hedwig's second daughter of Louis, he obtained the throne of Poland. This event happened in 1386, in which year he was publicly baptized, married, and crowned at Cracow, and assumed a new baptismal name of Ladislaus II. He died in 1434 in a very advanced age, in the 50th year of a long and glorious reign. Among his posterity, whose bodies are deposited in this cathedral, the most memorable is Sigismund I, a great and able monarch, the protector of the arts and sciences, which made no inconsiderable figure under his auspices. He is represented, however, as not sufficiently watchful over the royal prerogative, and as yielding too easily to the encroachments of the nobility, to the injury of succeeding monarchs, and the detriment of the republic. But these compliances admit of great palliation, when we reflect that the nobles, to whom they were made, had raised him to the throne, and were become nearly uncontrollable by the concessions of his immediate predecessors. As I viewed the tomb of Sigismund Augustus, son of the last-mentioned monarch, I recollected not without a mixture of regret and sympathy for this unhappy country, that in him terminated that hereditary influence which had given tranquillity during a long succession of sovereigns to the diets of election, and that upon his death all those troubles and confusions, which are inseparable from a crown wholly elective, broke in upon the kingdom. From this period the cabals and convulsions, continually recurring at every choice of a new sovereign, rapidly impaired the strength of the state and the dignity of the throne. The Poles gradually lost their consequence among foreign powers, and the authority of succeeding kings depended more on their own personal abilities and accidental circumstances than on any permanent principle of vigor inherent in the crown, which has been nearly stripped of all its prerogatives. The first of the new succession, whose remains are interred in this church, is Stephen Bathory, Prince of Transylvania, elected in 1576 upon the abdication of Henry of Valois. He owed his elevation to his marriage with Anne, daughter of Sigismund I, a princess who, being in the 52nd year of her age, was not endowed with any winning attractions if she had not brought a kingdom for her portion. The epitaph upon his tomb justly ascribes to Stephen a long catalogue of civil and military virtues. I came next to the sepulchre of his successor, Sigismund III, son of John III, King of Sweden, and of Catherine, daughter of Sigismund I, elected King of Poland in 1587. He revived in his person, on the female side, the race of the Jagiellon family. He was raised to the throne of this country while he was Prince Royal of Sweden, and upon the death of his father in 1592 possessed both crowns. But he gradually lost all authority in Sweden, and was at length formally deposed by the states of that kingdom. He owed his expulsion from Sweden to his partiality for Poland, to his bigoted zeal for the Catholic religion, and above all to the superior genius of his uncle and rival, Charles IX. He expired in the 46th year of his reign, and in the 67th of his age. Near the body of Sigismund lie those of his two sons. The eldest, named Ladislaus IV, elected King of Poland upon the demise of his father, supported the dignity of his crown with reputation and honor. The second, John Casimir, was a prince, whose character and adventures are too singular to be passed over without particular notice. John Casimir, son of Sigismund III, by a second wife Anne, sister of the Emperor Ferdinand II, was educated in his father's court, upon whose death his mother endeavored, but without effect, to procure his election to the throne, in opposition to his elder brother Ladislaus IV. Repulsed from the throne, he contracted a disgust to Poland, and undertook a journey to Spain with a view of offering his services to his cousin Philip IV, then at war with France. Passing through Austria and Trent into Italy, he embarked at Genoa in a vessel bound for Spain, but prompted by curiosity, he ventured to land incognito at Marseille. Being discovered, he was arrested by order of the court of France, and, on account of his connection with the House of Austria, closely imprisoned for the space of 2 years. Being at length released at the intercession of his brother, the King of Poland, he repaired to Rome, and there, either out of devotion or caprice, entered into the order of the Jesuits. Afterwards, grown weary of his function, he quitted that order and was promoted to the rank of cardinal. Upon the death of his brother, Ladislaus IV, being absolved from his vows by the Pope, he was elected King of Poland, and, having obtained a dispensation, married his brother's widow, Louisa Maria, daughter of the Duke of Nevers, a woman of great beauty and still greater spirit, who blended devotion with a strong propensity to political intrigues. The soul of her husband's counsels, she may be said to have reigned over Poland while he was only nominal king. Such was her ascendancy that she prevailed upon him to solicit the nomination of the Duke of Enghien, son of the great Condé, for his successor. A measure so contradictory to the first principles of the Polish constitution, as well as to his coronation oath, excited a general discontent and threw the kingdom into the most violent commotions. The reign of John Casimir was active and turbulent, memorable for the revolt of the Cossacks of the Ukraine, for the unsuccessful wars with Sweden, and for the insurrections of the nobility. Though so far from being deficient in military courage, that in every desperate emergency, he always commanded his troops in person, though, to use his own expression, he was the first to attack and the last to retreat. Yet, as he preferred peace to war, and wanted the enterprising spirit of his brother Ladislaus IV, he was accused by the Poles of indolence and pusillanimity. His political sagacity appears from his predictions that Poland, enfeebled by the anarchy of its government and the licentiousness of the nobles, would necessarily be dismembered by the neighboring powers. Worn out at length with the cares of royalty, shocked at the distressed state of the kingdom, discontented with the factions of the nobility, afflicted at the death of his wife, and impelled by the versatility of his disposition, he abdicated the throne in the 20th year of his reign, and in the 68th of his age. This extraordinary event took place on the 27th of August, in the year 1668, before a general diet assembled at Warsaw. The scene was affecting, the conduct of the king manly and resolute, and his speech upon that event is the finest piece of pathetic eloquence recorded in history. Soon after his abdication, he retired into France and again embraced the ecclesiastical profession. Louis XIV, who prided himself in affording an asylum to abdicated sovereigns, gave him the abbeys of Saint-Germain and Saint-Martin, without which he would have had no means of subsistence, as Poland soon withheld his pension, a proof that the tears which were shed at his abdication were not sincere. Notwithstanding his ecclesiastical engagements, John Casimir could not withstand the attractions of Marie Mignot, a woman who, from being a laundress, had been married first to a councillor of Grenoble and afterwards to the Marshal de l'Hôpital. She was a widow when she attracted the notice of the abdicated king, and so powerful was the impression he received that it was suspected he was secretly married to her. Casimir is represented by those who knew him in his retirement as easy and familiar in his conversation, and displeased with receiving any honours or titles due to his former rank. He survived his abdication only 4 years and died at Nevers on the 16th of December, 1672. His body was brought to this city and buried in the cathedral at the same time with that of his successor Michael, the day before the coronation of John Sobieski. Upon approaching the remains of John Sobieski, I recollected that when Charles XII of Sweden entered Cracow, he visited these tombs in order to pay a mark of respect to the memory of that great monarch. He is reported, as he hung with reverence over his sepulchre, to have cried out,
"What a pity that so great a man should ever die."
May we not also exclaim, what a pity that a person so impressed with a sense of Sobieski's virtues should adopt only the military part of his character for the object of his imitation. How infinitely inferior is the Swedish to the Polish sovereign. The former, dead to all the finer feelings of humanity, was awake only to the calls of ambition, every other sentiment being lost in the ardour for military honours. If personal courage be sufficient to constitute a hero, he possessed that quality in an eminent degree, but it was rather the bravery of a common soldier than of a general. Sobieski, even in that view of his character, has an equal title to fame, for his valour was no less distinguished, and in one respect was superior, as it was not clouded with rashness, but tempered with prudence. Though the first general of his age, he placed not his sole ambition in military glory. He was great in peace as well as in war. By the union of talents belonging to each department, he defended his country from impending danger, raised her from her falling state, and delayed during his reign the era of her decline. While Charles, who was deficient in civil virtues, plunged Sweden, which he found highly prosperous, into ruin and desolation. In a word, Charles had the enthusiasm of a knight-errant, and Sobieski the virtues of an hero. About an English mile from Cracow are the remains of an old structure, called the Palace of Casimir the Great, which my veneration for that sovereign induced me to visit, as there is a singular pleasure arising from seeing the spot that was once dignified by the residence of an admired character. Little, I imagine, of the original palace, as it was built by Casimir, exists at present. In the inner court are the remains of a corridor with pillars of the Doric order, and upon one of the side walls I observed the white eagle of Poland carved in stone, and around it an inscription seemingly in old Gothetic characters, of which I could only make out Anno Domini 1367, which answers to the era of Casimir, who died in 1370. Several marble columns were scattered around, which showed the ancient magnificence of the building. The greatest part of the fabric was evidently of later date than the reign of Casimir, and was probably constructed by succeeding sovereigns upon the foundation of the ancient palace, perhaps by Stephen Bathory, as I could trace in one place an inscription Stephanus de Gratia, and also by Sigismund III, as I discovered his cipher with the wheat sheaf, the arms of Gustavus Vasa, from whom he was lineally descended. This palace was the principal residence of Casimir. In the garden is a mound of earth, or one of those barrows before mentioned, which is called the tomb of Esther the fair Jewess, who was the favourite mistress of that monarch. To the influence of Esther, it is said the Jews owe the numerous privileges enjoyed by them in Poland, which is called the Paradise of the Jews. But when the character of Casimir is considered, it will appear probable that they were indebted for their favourable reception in Poland more to his policy than to his affection for his mistress. For in those times, the Jews were the richest and most commercial individuals in Europe, by allowing them, therefore, to settle in Poland, and by granting them some extraordinary immunities, he introduced trade and much wealth into his dominions. The number of Jews is now prodigious, and they have in a manner engrossed all the commerce of the country. Yet this flourishing state of their affairs must not be attributed solely to the edicts of Casimir in their favour, but to the industry of those extraordinary people, to the indolence of the gentry, and the oppressed condition of the peasants.